In episode 19 of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, we will have a very special guest, the ethnomusicologist Lénica Reyes, to talk about the malagueñas in the 19th century. She's an expert in malagueñas. Her doctoral dissertation on malagueñas was awarded as the best dissertation of her generation at UNAM, Mexico, the most prestigious Spanish-speaking university in the world. We will also listen to a malagueña of that time.
Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. And yet, there is still something we can do for them. Let us summon them. Let us summon them.
Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo, and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces, and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco. Hello, and thank you for listening to this new episode of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. In this episode, we are going to talk about one of the queens of the flamenco in the 19th century, a song that perhaps together with the peteneras led flamenco to gain popularity in Spain at the end of the 19th century, as I think it never had again, not even in our days. I am referring to the malagueñas. But before starting, let me remind you how important it is to share the episodes you like on your socials and subscribe to this podcast, if you have not already done so. You have different options: iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iVoox, or the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados ethnomusicología creativa, depending on your favorite platform. It is impossible to talk about what the malagueña meant in the 19th century only in this episode, so I will dedicate many others to comment on many exciting stories around the malagueñas and to listen to some of its forgotten sounds, which there are many and very interesting. And to talk about the malagueñas in the 19th century in today's episode, I invited a person who has studied these malagueñas for years, not only in its flamenco variant, but in all its dimensions and local versions both in Spain and Mexico. And the result of this was her doctoral dissertation in ethnomusicology at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Her dissertation was entitled The 19th Century Malagueñas in Spain and Mexico, History and Musical System. I am referring to Lénica Reyes, who also obtained the Alfonso Caso Award at UNAM for the best dissertation of her generation, precisely for this work.
Welcome, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation to participate in this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a pleasure to share this moment with you and the audience.
Last week we celebrated 4 years of the project Forgotten Sounds, creative ethnomusicology, of which you are a co-founder, so congratulations and thank you very much.
Yes, what an impression already. 4 years of carrying out this beautiful project, and let's hope for many more.
Well, I wanted to ask why you decided to study the malagueñas in your doctoral dissertation.
Well, that is an excellent question because, in reality, what I wanted to do in my doctoral dissertation was to investigate Mexican malagueñas, to study the diversity of malagueñas in my country, and to see if I could more or less replicate the methodology that I had implemented in my master's dissertation to investigate peteneras in Mexico. Still, when I started the research, I realized that I could not throw myself into the ring. Let's say I could not do that without previously investigating the malagueñas in Spain in the 19th century, because I began to find very diverse information with a lot of data. I also found that although it is mentioned a lot, it is a musical expression that was not investigated in depth, so I modified my topic of study. I decided to research the malagueñas in Spain in the 19th century.
It is very complicated to answer this question, but how would you briefly define the 19th century malagueña in Spain?
Malagueñas are musical pieces with a significant presence in Spain, Mexico, and other American countries such as Venezuela. To simplify, we could say that they are pieces that have a somewhat faster tempo than the current flamenco malagueñas, which are composed of one or more coplas interspersed by a succession of instrumental motifs, also called variations or falsetas, and while the instrumental part is in what is called a dominant Phrygian mode, the vocal part is in a major key. A characteristic aspect of the malagueñas is that it was used to show vocal or interpretative qualities. In some verses of the coplas or instrumental variations, they used to be generally very ornamented, much more than in other musical expressions, such as the fandango. For example, we find a big difference in the number of ornamentations. To illustrate this, I would like to share two fragments I found in the press while doing documentary research for my dissertation, which reflect this virtuosic characteristic of the malagueñas. In a story by Eduardo López Vago, published in a Mexican newspaper in 1880, he tells the story of a student from Seville who writes about one of his encounters with his beloved. I will read the fragment. It goes like this. Lola put more carnations than ever on her head. From the fence railing, she removed the idea of a row of flower pots to be closer to me, and her 7 sentences came to have more variations than the music of a malagueña for piano.
This text is great.
I found another one in the Noticiero de Salamanca in 1900. I read, last night 2 subjects were taken to the prevention for slapping each other in the street of the company to enjoy for which of them sang better malagueñas. Well then, we see that, in addition, the malagueñas raised passions.
Prevention is what is now called the police station.
Yes, indeed.
They beat each other in the street to see who sang the best malagueñas. You also conclude in your dissertation that the malagueñas were very popular, right?
Oh yes, indeed. It is a musical expression that was very fashionable in the 19th century. It is one of the most long-lived musical expressions. I don't know if it is one of the longest-lived, but it has been very long-lived since the beginning of the 19th century and is still alive today. It had an extraordinary diffusion in Spain in the 19th century.
And when you refer to the incredible popularity of the malagueñas in the 19th century, I understand that you are not only referring to the malagueña flamenca, right?
I must say that the malagueñas in the 19th century were not always flamenco variants. They were part of the different musical cultures of several regions of Spain. For the same reason, they will be interpreted with their own singing style and instrumental vocation. Still, they share the structures that I mentioned.
In your dissertation, I also find your analysis of the vocal technique used to interpret the malagueñas of that time fascinating. Could you comment briefly on how those flamenco malagueñas were sung?
Curiously, they were not necessarily performed with a vocal technique, as we know today, of flamenco singing. There were a variety of styles with which they could be sung. For example, if they were sung in the theater within a zarzuela that identified that a malagueña flamenco would be sung, it was sung with a vocal technique typical of zarzuela, even opera. There are even recordings from the beginning of the 20th century with variants of malagueñas sung with that technique. That is very nice. I think that in the 19th century in flamenco, there was more freedom of interpretation, of creation, of interpretation in which it was not necessarily pigeonholed to a single type of practice. I find it very interesting that they could be interpreted with different vocal techniques. In one of my chapters, one of the last of my dissertation, I develop all the transformations that the malagueña had from the beginning. The variations in its interpretation, from the beginning of the 19th century until the beginning of the 20th century. It is exciting to see the transformations the malagueñas had throughout the century.
And in what space did the malagueñas were listened to?
Well, I could tell you that by the second half of the 19th century, they were practically in all the performative fields, from the scenic to the domestic, military, religious, etc. They were practically in all the soundtrack of the people in Spain in the 19th century.
And specifically, what role did the malagueña play in the incipient flamenco of the last third of the 19th century?
Well, I think that the role of the malagueña has been fundamental in the flamenco of that time. It was one of the most famous contests and the most preferred by the public. I think that, together with the patinera, at the time of the flamenco mania, they were the kings of the flamenco scene.
Sometimes, flamencos think that the malagueña was only in flamenco. No, it was in many regions of Spain. Even today, they are still preserved. For example, those of the Canary Islands are incredibly beautiful. In Valencia, in many other areas of Spain, these malagueñas are still kept. I wanted to ask you about the instrumentation used to play those malagueñas. What musical instruments were the most common?
Well, it all depends on the musical occasions they performed. For example, we are talking about stage performances. In that case, the piano, for example, the orchestra, quintet, or string quartet, depends on the instrumentation of the piece of which it was part. If we go to a more civil sphere, let's say, the guitar would undoubtedly be the instrument with which I most played the malagueñas. There were also bands. That is to say, I found diverse musical instruments with which the malagueñas were interpreted. Still, I would say that the guitar in the first place and the piano is also a fundamental instrument.
Well, if you like, let's listen to another of these 19th century malagueñas, specifically the one entitled La Más Flamenca. Grand Malagueña, composed by Francisco Tamayo y Montes in 1879, which contains several malagueña songs among them, Cartagenera, Malagueñas de Almería or Haberes, as indicated in the score. In this beginning, we hear the piano imitating a guitarist tuning the guitar strings, and it is curious how the author indicates in some parts of the score the notation imitating the guitar. This piece is an excellent example of this virtuosity implicit in the malagueña you mentioned above. of virtuosity was both instrumental and vocal. Finally, could you tell us briefly about some of the variants of malagueñas that we can find in your country, Mexico?
Well, we can say that we have already found Mexican variants of malagueñas since around 1840, and we found them in the hot land, in the part of Michoacán. Nowadays, we find them in the Tierra Caliente zone, the Costa Chica, the Huasteca region, and the Isthmus area. That is to say, there are different variants, and each one is different. They are interpreted with different musical instruments, and all of them are very beautiful. As I was saying, what I wanted to do was to investigate them as a whole, but first, I realized that what I had to do first was to focus on those of the 19th century.
Yes, some of these variants are, as you say, beautiful and very similar to ours. Well, it is fascinating everything you are sharing with us. If you like, I invite you to future episodes where we can address in more depth some of the exciting things you have told us in this first taste, about how the malagueña was and what role they occupied, not only in flamenco but within the Spanish music or that of Mexico. Thank you again, and I hope to see you here soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation and greetings to all the audience that cannot be heard.
It has been an absolute pleasure to have an expert on malagueñas and learn more about our great-great-grandparents' flamenco. If you like this episode, I would appreciate if you share it so that other people can enjoy it too. And if you want to receive notifications when new episodes are released or listen to previous episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. I'll be waiting for you here again in 2 weeks.